A quick effect in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is something that a monster can use during either player's turn, or just something that's technically spell speed too. And generally, monsters with quick effects are really good, because they allow you to impact the field during your opponent's turn outside of just spell and trap cards. But in this list, we're going to go over 10 of the worst monsters that have a quick effect. And at number 10, we have Wattkinetic Puppeteer. This is a monster that has a quick effect from the hand, where you can send it to the graveyard in order to target one of your opponent's monsters in order to move it to another one of their main monster zones. Now, normally, moving your opponent's monsters around in the main monster zone isn't a big deal, and definitely not something you want to go -1 in order to accomplish as the sole effect. But there are definitely situations in which this is incredibly useful, mainly with link monsters, since they really need to point to specific zones in order to do a lot of the things they do. For example, if your opponent brings out a Guard Dragon LP, you can just move it to a different zone in order to completely screw with the arrows, since that card needs to have 2 link arrows pointing to the same zone in order to special summon a dragon from the deck. And the card itself also locks the player out of summoning anything else besides dragons, so it's more difficult for them to try to recover from moving that card over a position. And that's why Wattkinetic Puppeteer actually saw some niche play in the early days of the Link era, as a side deck addition in a couple of decks that topped some events. Although very quickly it stopped seeing play, since there's just kind of better cards to use if you want to stop your opponent from using link monsters. Fantastical Dragon Phantasme, or just normal generic hand traps like Nibiru the Primal Being. The problem with Wattkinetic Puppeteer is that it doesn't actually give you any kind of advantage. It can just situationally stop your opponent from continuing their combo plays without depriving them of any sort of advantage either, which isn't that bad, and why it only takes number 10 spot on this list, being definitely the best of the bunch. And at number 9, we have Winged Rhynos. This is a card which has the effect that if a player activates a trap card, you can then activate this card's effect, which just returns it from the field back to your hand. It doesn't do anything else. The full advantage of this card is just return it to your hand in response to a trap card. Now, needless to say, this doesn't really generate advantage, but you'd be surprised to hear this card actually saw some competitive play in the past in a couple of anti-meta decks. You see, there's this deck that involves Wind Up Rabbit and Evil Swarm Thunderbird, where they basically activate full board wipes like Torrential Tribute and then dodge the effects with their Spell Speed 2 effects, that then allow them to remove themselves from play for a turn before returning to the field at the end of the turn. Generally, those 2 cards were the only main deck monsters in those kinds of decks, but occasionally, some of those decks would drop Evil Swarm Thunderbird in order to take up Winged Rhynos for that kind of same effect, because they would play a more Beast Warrior-centric archetype along with it, and could bring the card out back pretty easily, thanks to Fire Formation Tensu. This is a card part of the Fire Fist archetype, which is searched out very easily with a lot of their Fire Fist monsters, and basically increases the attack of all of your Beast Warrior monsters by 100, and allows you an additional normal summon of a Beast Warrior type monster per turn. So with it being able to bring out an additional Beast Warrior pretty easily, they could afford the negative effect of Winged Rhynos in order to dodge trap effects, in the same way as Wind Up Rabbit and Evil Swarm Thunderbird. Although this was kind of an offshoot of a deck that was already barely tier 2, so it wasn't used very much, but it definitely saw some niche use because of other cards that allowed you to offset its side effects. Eventually, it stopped being run altogether because Wind Up Rabbit and Evil Swarm Thunderbird were just good enough on their own, and didn't need additional support in order to come back to the field, which is why Winged Rhynos kind of got left behind, and isn't really good in decks outside of that one very specific anti-meta deck, which isn't really viable anymore. Again though, Winged Rhynos and Wattkinetic Puppeteer are the only 2 cards on this list that saw any kind of competitive play in the past. Everything else below them do not share the same distinction. And at number 8, we have Achacha Chanbara. This is a level 3 warrior, which could special summon itself from your hand in response to the effect of a card that would inflict effect damage when it resolves. Afterwards, you then get to inflict 400 points of effect damage to your opponent. So, if you're able to inflict self-effect damage to yourself with cards like Perform H Trickhound or Blackwing Zephyros the Elite, 2 cards that do see a lot of play and also happen to inflict damage to the player who uses them, you could just chain Achacha Chanbara to those cards' effects in order to special summon it from your hand and do a tiny bit of burn damage to your opponent. Now, the reason this doesn't see play is because there's lots of other level 3 monsters that can special summon themselves from the hand much easier without requiring a trigger of taking or dealing effect damage, which is pretty rare outside of decks that have the sole purpose of doing effect damage. Generally, decks that are all about burn damage don't care about special summoning monsters from their hand, nor inflicting a tiny amount of burn damage that this card provides. Even in the two examples of the cards that meet the conditions of this effect pretty easily, those two monsters are kind of played in decks that revolve around level 4 monsters, so they wouldn't want to use this card anyway. And there aren't really good level 3 equivalents that are super popular or played like Zephyros the Elite or Trick Clown. If this card was level 4, it might see play. If they were releasing an archetype of level 3 monsters that happen to inflict damage and need a warrior type monster as part of their combo from the hand, then it might see play. But special summoning from the hand is not super unique, and part of the reason Zephyros and Trick Clown see play is because they special summon themselves from the graveyard, a much more valuable place for a monster to special summon itself from. And at number 7, we have Flying Carp. This is a level 4 monster with only 500 attack, and it has the quick effect where you can discard one water monster to have this card gain 500 attack. The attack boost is permanent, so if you want a card that can ditch a single water monster in your hand to the graveyard real quickly, Flying Carp can definitely accomplish that goal. And there's even a couple of other water monsters who gain effects if they're used as a cost to activate a water monster's effect, like the entire Atlantean archetype. And a permanent attack boost is pretty good, but it has such a low baseline starting point that you'd have to discard way too many cards over the course of a handful of turns for it to be worth it, in order for it to get to a high enough value where it would actually be able to destroy something by battle. But it does also have an effect if it accomplishes that goal, where if it manages to destroy a monster by battle, you can then tribute this card in order to special summon any one fish, sea serpent, or aqua type monster from your hand or deck. And this effect is not half bad. There are a couple of really good high level fish and aqua type monsters to bring out from the deck, but not really sea serpent targets though. This could allow you to cheat out of the Tripper Mercury, who can attack twice baseline, or a Hyper Ancient Shark Megalodon, who can destroy cards if it inflicts battle damage, Super Ancient Deep Sea King Coelacanth or Citadel Whale if you're playing one of those cards' archetypes. You probably don't want to rely on Flying Carp to bring out any of those monsters though, but there are some decent targets if you're able to pull it off. However, it does have a nice usage thanks to the fact that its effect is a quick effect that can be activated whenever you want during your opponent's turn. Where if you use its effect to ditch Atlantean heavy infantry, it basically gives you spell speed 2 monster removal, which is actually not half bad. Although you'd be heavily reliant on having Atlanteans in your hand, and the effect is a hard once per turn, so you wouldn't be able to do it more than once anyway. And at number 6, we have Gauntlet Warrior. This is a level 3 warrior with only 400 attack, which has the quick effect where you can tribute this card during either player's turn in order to make it so all warrior type monsters you control gain 500 attack and defense until the end of the next damage step that monster attacks or is attacked. So basically, it will give all of your warriors a temporary attack boost, which will only be consumed as soon as they're involved in a battle, which is a pretty unique way to give them an attack boost. But this card has to be on the field in order to activate this effect, and if it was a hand effect, it probably wouldn't be very good. The fact that it needs to get itself on the field first means you need to use other resources or your precious normal summon in order to get this card on the field, in order to then tribute it to give your other warrior monsters a mediocre attack boost. There are some decent cards which have to tribute themselves in order to grant an attack boost, like YuGiOh, but that card allows it to special summon itself from the hand. It also has a nice use of granting you life points and providing a slightly better attack boost at 1000, plus having a better baseline attack of 1700. So you can actually use it to deal damage before it tags out in order to give another monster a higher attack boost value for a turn. Gauntlet Warrior is supposed to be an AoE attack booster, but attack boosters aren't very good in YuGiOh unless they provide an astronomical attack boost, or provide attack boost on top of some other good effect like YuGiOh. And at number 5, we have Master Craftsman Gamil. This is a monster which can increase the attack of a monster by 300 until the end of the turn, and can at least be used from the hand unlike Gauntlet Warrior. The only problem is that this is an incredibly minor amount of attack points to grant a target. Sure, it's nice that it's generic and works on anything, unlike Gauntlet Warrior, or other valuable attack increase in hand traps like Honest or Blackwing Kalut the Moon Shadow. But 300 is so minor that it's basically a non-effect. The card even came out in 2014, so it's not like it was introduced in the early days of the game when attack boosts were all minor. This came out in kind of the modern format, in the middle of the Xyz era, and even then, the card was kind of worthless. When the card was released in Duel Links, it didn't even see any play in that limited card pool version of the game. But it did see play in speed duels, funny enough. Speed duels are basically Duel Links rules but with physical cards, and they kind of have their own format of allowed cards, and in that incredibly limited and specific format, they did release this card and it did see some competitive play there, but that's about it. At the very least, it's generic and not tied to an incredibly specific type of monster or archetype, and surprisingly, is better than the top 4 spots on this list. And at number 4, we have Red Gardna. This card can only be activated if you control a Red Dragon Archfiend monster, and the effect is, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard in order to make it so that your monsters cannot be destroyed by your opponent's card effects in response to the effect of an opponent's card. So it only prevents a destruction a single time, and generally is a pretty good effect to have on graveyard cards like Neos Fusion or Return of the Dragon Lords. But the reason this kind of effect is good on those cards is because they do something else valuable in addition to the protection effect. They're not played because of their effect to protect, which is the only thing Red Gardna does. And since it needs to be activated from the hand and not the graveyard, it's also just not as useful as those 2 cards either. And it only prevents destruction from card effects and not battle, so it's slightly worse than those 2 cards as well. And since it's tied to an incredibly specific archetype requiring one of their synchro monsters to be on the field, it's basically just a pack fill that no one really expected to see any kind of play, and it didn't. Funny enough, Return of the Dragon Lords would probably be better at protecting Red Dragon Archfiend monsters on the field than Red Gardna anyway. And at number 3, we have Shinobird Crow. This is a spirit monster, which means it cannot be special summoned and returns to the hand during the end phase that you normal summon it or flip it face up, where it has 0 attack and defense and has a quick effect where when this card battles an opponent's monster, you can discard a spirit monster from your hand in order to allow this card to gain that monster's attack and defense until the end of the battle phase. This effect is also once per turn, so you can't give this card something like double attack to allow it to attack twice in order to discard an extra monster in order to gain a significant attack boost, which honestly wouldn't be worth the effort even if you could do that. If the card had any kind of stats on top of the attack boost it can provide itself, then maybe it would have seen some kind of play, but the fact that you need to go -1 in order to allow this card to have any kind of stats is kinda bad, especially since it does nothing outside of granting itself a temporary attack boost. Not only does it do nothing outside of this effect, it's inherently a detriment to even play this card because of the restrictions of spirit monsters. Spirit monsters need to be stronger than normal cards because of all the limitations they have, and occasionally, some spirit monsters do see competitive play because they have really good effects to justify those restrictions, like Imano Iwato or Shinobaroness Peacock. And at number 2, we have Amazona Scouts. This is a level 2 Amazon monster, which has a quick effect where you can tribute this card so that your face-up Amazona's monsters cannot be targeted by monster effects, and also cannot be destroyed by card effects in general. So it seems like some decent protection, although there is a few things wrong with this card that kind of make it so it didn't really see play in Amazon decks. The first of it is the card is level 2 and can't special summon itself. The Amazona's archetype is all about level 3 and 4 monsters, so it's kind of at an awkward level where it doesn't really gel with the rest of the archetype. They do have Amazona's Baby Tiger, which is also level 2 and does see play in Amazon decks, but that's because the card can special summon itself very easily from the graveyard, so it's just pure advantage. Outside of its awkward level, the effect itself isn't really good. The protection it provides isn't really needed and would serve much better if it was a graveyard effect, similar to Neos Fusion, and probably wouldn't see play even if it was a hand effect. So it's kind of like Gauntlet Warrior, where you have to waste resources in order to get this card on the field for an effect that Amazoness monsters don't really need. And it also doesn't have any uses outside of its effect, since it doesn't really fit into the archetype very well, which is why it's definitely one of the worst monsters with a quick effect, only being out the top spot because it at least belongs to a potential tier 3 archetype. And at number 1, we have Cyber Ogre. This is a level 5 monster with only 1900 attack, which is kind of low for a high level monster, where it has a hand effect that if you have another copy of Cyber Ogre on the field, you can discard this card from your hand in order to negate one battle involving a Cyber Ogre monster. Then, after a battle is negated, it will gain 2000 attack until the end of its next battle, similar to Gauntlet Warrior's battle increase, where it lasts until they participate in a battle. So basically, the entire effect of this card is a quick effect from the hand, which only works on other copies of itself that are not easy to get on the field, since it's a level 5 monster. but it is part of its own incredibly small Cyber Ogre archetype, which also doesn't really do a good job of getting this card in the field. The archetype has a card called Byroad Sacrifice, which is a trap card that can only be activated if a monster you control is destroyed by battle, which then allows you to special summon a Cyber Ogre from your hand. If this card didn't have the trigger on the effect, and just allowed you to special summon a Cyber Ogre from your hand whenever you wanted, it still wouldn't be good, because a trap card that allows you to special summon a monster from the hand is pretty weak. It would have to let you special summon the monster from the deck or graveyard to be worth playing. But it's also attached to a trigger of having to have one of your monsters destroyed by battle first, which kind of puts it at garbage tier. There's also a fusion monster for the archetype called Cyber Ogre 2, which simply requires any 2 Cyber Ogre monsters as materials, and has a built-in Metalmorph effect that if it attacks the monster can gain half the attack of the monster during the damage step. So, not a half bad attack boost. The fusion monster is kind of decent. Not super good, but a lot better than the other 2 cards of the archetype. And that's about it. This is a 3-card archetype which never saw play or got any new support, and I find it kind of funny. Which is why I have to put this at the number 1 spot on this list, because it's so restrictive with how it can use its effect, and it's not even that good. At least Amazoness Scouts works with an entire archetype that has more than 3 cards in it, although I guess technically Cyber Ogre's hand effect is still better than Amazoness Scout's effect, but since the target of the effect is so bad, it kinda has to be the number 1 on this list. Alright, and that's the list. If you think there's any other worst spell speed 2 monster effects in the game that I may have missed, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments, as well as ideas for future videos just like this one. And also, did you know only 39.1% of people who watch these videos are actually subscribed to the channel?